You're watching Open Agenda. Here's our host, Joe White.
Welcome to Open Agenda. I'm your host, Joe White. In the studio with us now is Ms. Trish Melvin from Fruitland. Thank you. Mr. Michael Langford from Salisbury. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks for having me.
Michael, you have been working very diligently on an investigation into the residency and eligibility of former Council President Deshaun Doughty and his role as Council President. You filed a complaint in early October stating that you had evidence, which you shared with us here, of him no longer residing in Salisbury from at least 2 months ago, maybe even up to 9 months ago, correct?
Correct.
I want to go through that because, at the end of the day, public trust in your elected officials is of the utmost importance. To some degree, to some level, this has been violated. And at the same time, it felt like with the press release that came out last Friday, it's being swept under the rug. And Trish, I'd like to have Joe Venosa come in and talk about this timeline. And then I'd like to come back in and get your perspective after having heard this evidence and see how you feel like the press release and the press's coverage of this incident has it aligned up with what the facts are. Okay. All right. All right, will you stick around, Michael?
Absolutely, thank you.
All right, so when we come back, we're going to bring in Dr. Joe Venosa. We're going to go through the timeline of President Doughty's resignation. Welcome back to Open Agenda. In the studio with us is Dr. Joe Venosa. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you.
Michael Langford, thanks for sticking around. So, Michael, you have asserted that Deshaun Doughty has knowingly and intentionally deceived the voters, the election board, and the city of Salisbury. So I want you to explain how have you come to know that he's done this and done it intentionally?
Well, man, it just starts by listening. What we do here on the show all the time. And I kept hearing that Deshaun lived across the bridge. And I kept hearing this from different people in the community. It was not like one person from one background or one kind of political disposition. And I just kept hearing this, and it was a strange thing. And frankly, people... I don't know. True crime is huge, right? I don't know why people don't dig more, but there's a lot publicly available. So I bothered to do that work, and then I was shocked to find that, he both working in Bel Air and living in Essex, which is in Baltimore County.
So, Dr. Venosa, we've heard that former Council President Doughty was on another radio show stating that this was just the last couple months and that the details are vague. But we're looking at Michael's research here. There's nothing vague about this. In fact, the thing that might be the most vague is whether or not this actually started in January of 2025. So, Michael, I want to talk about, you used court documents, specifically where collections notices were served for civil complaints against former Council President Deshaun Doughty by multiple entities, a doctor, the state of Maryland, a finance company. Some of these documents were not able to be served as soon as January 15th, 2025, with another attempt on January 24th, 2025, and then again 2 more attempts in June of 2025. What is this telling you about the trend of when he actually was likely not a true resident of Salisbury any longer?
Yeah, potentially as recently as January, that he was not in the address that he was registered with when he filed for the city, which is 422 Creekbed Circle.
Okay. Now, Dr. Venosa, we've talked about many times the conflict of interest when former Council President Deshaun Doughty worked for Green Street Housing. We came to realize back in the spring that he was no longer employed there. Now, we did not report it or discuss it. That's a personnel matter. Sure. However, in the court documents that Michael Langford has picked up, there was a wage garnishment that was put on his salary in May 23rd, 2025, and it was not able to be served because he was no longer employed at that time. So that's official court document.
It is.
There's also a finance company, Mariner Finance, who had a suit against him, as well as a doctor out of Berlin. And some of those documents were not able to be served in September in 2025.
Most recent, yeah.
So, Michael, you also have found some housing information. We know his address in Essex now. We know that house was on the market for rental, correct?
Yes, and the house in Essex, the interesting thing is that came from the kiosk at the district courthouse, and that has to be updated by Deshaun. So this is the part where he knowingly and intentionally deceives us all, is that he had to update the Essex address. So he knows, because he's telling, I guess, HR with the city, who's updating it in the courthouse records, that in order for him to receive mail, it's Essex.
And when was that?
We don't know when he updated it, right? But we checked it in early October. I initially filed my complaint on the 2nd, and I believe I found the Essex thing a couple days actually after I filed the initial complaint.
So sometime in October. We know that he's employed currently at the Bank of America on Tollgate Road in Bel Air. In fact, you have found his professional page that lists not only his office, but his phone number. And you've done a mapping of how long it would take to drive there. It's over 3 hours, correct?
Correct.
So is it fair to say that he was not living in Salisbury?
That was the thing that made me dig. When I saw that he was on their website, even if they're slow to update it, it's like, well, they got him on it initially, so he's been working there for a while. And then you look at that and you see how one of the things that actually raised the red flag to me is it is common for the city council in Salisbury to go to every 2 weeks during the summer so people can take vacations and stuff with family. However, before 2025, we can see that the council met like every week. That is the normal way unless it's summer.
1 week would have been a work session and the next week a legislative session.
Correct. Right? And now we're doubling up. And we've been doing that all of 2025, again, since January. So we are now getting...
So it's highly plausible that this whole rescheduling of our city government is possibly because Deshaun Dowdy, that time period, was living over the bridge in violation of our city code.
Yes.
Well, and so let's talk about the city code. There was a charter amendment 2024-2 that allowed for a change in wording that you did not have to live in your district but domiciled.
Correct.
Wow. We are parsing words here. Government isn't really good at semantics anyway. But
Truckee University.
Well, what does that mean? I mean, does that mean that he doesn't have to have a legal address, but he can just be staying on a couch somewhere?
So I'm still waiting to hear back from law offices on how you would establish the criterion, because there is not actually a legal definition of domicile. There is a legal definition of residency because like the state can establish residency, right? And there are certain procedures around housing that have to do with one's residency. But domiciling is a specific political like maneuver on their part to avoid accountability, I believe.
And I remember this kind of came up a little bit back in the mayoral election in 2013 when there was some controversy perhaps over Megan Oughton's residency in the city, and the election board had to examine that and kind of come to the same issue with, well, what is residency versus domiciling? And I guess that change was in part a reflection of the problems we've had with other candidates and people in office, right?
Well, what we do know is that on October 17th, 2025, the Board of Elections had a closed session regarding the complaint that Michael Langford filed, amongst others. I think others have also filed. But his address wasn't changed until the same date. Now, it went from
voter registration.
Voter registration was changed to another address in Salisbury. So does this speak to a cover-up? Is this an attempt? Because you have documentation that the house that he was initially lived in was sold, correct?
Correct.
So he really couldn't state that he lived there anymore. There's ESTAT documents that say he definitely didn't live there because it had new ownership.
Correct.
And it was only at the point that there was a closed session, because I don't want people to lose sight of this. The days matter. October 17th is 9 business days prior to his resignation, which was, I believe, carefully orchestrated on a Friday afternoon to avoid a lot of press coverage. That was the last work day that he could actually address the allegations against him with the Board of Elections that met in the closed session, correct?
Correct. That's my understanding from the city clerk, who I filed my complaint with. And so afterwards, once I reached out afterwards, and that was actually last Friday, was the last date for him to respond to the official inquiry from the election board. And instead of responding, he resigned.
Now, Dr. Venosa, we got to talk about the local media coverage here. We saw on Friday this press release from former council president Deshaun Dowdy stating he was resigning for a business opportunity. I think Michael has laid it out perfectly clear that this was a cover up, at least months in the making, but maybe 9 months in the making. At the same time, our local media pushed out the press release as written and then directly moved on to crosswalks.
Well, let's get to that, but let me say this even before that. It's my understanding that no one on the city council, and certainly not the mayor's office and anybody in the city administration, ever was told by Deshaun Dowdy that he had resigned. He never even called to say, hey guys, heads up, I'm resigning. Now this is someone who's been the city council president, whose job it is to help organize, meetings and run the city government. So to totally ghost and abandon and truly jump ship in that, my opinion, extremely cowardly, pathetic way is almost comical if it didn't affect real things. So that very, in my opinion, also AI-generated influenced letter that he released, as you said, was sent out with no contact of any local officials. It was sent out effectively, as you said, on a Friday, as basically it seems like he was running away. And the local media, which we have been deeply critical of, and I think for good reason, that's part of why we have done what we do throughout the past 18 months, basically doesn't report the news. What do? They take the press release and they just echo it out. In fact, the whole time this was happening, I thought of the George Orwell quote, that basically this is just public relations, right? It's not real media. It's not investigative journalism. It's not even questioning at the most basic level. And then you have what I also think is a very coordinated effort by the Secretary of Housing, Jake Day, and his friends in the local media to push other stories, because this also needs to be said, Deshaun Dowdy, in a lot of people's informal discussions, was Jake's handpicked successor to be the next mayor of Salisbury, or at least to help the pro-development changes that have been in the works. And that crashed and burned in a pretty epic way, and it makes sense why they don't want to focus on this story.
Yeah, I mean, this story has been whitewashed in a lot of ways away from the crosswalk.
Sure.
And we're not here to debate the crosswalk issue, but at the end of the day, this former council president, has appointed folks onto the Planning and Zoning Committee, has also blocked appointments to other committees, and also made a decisive vote last January that for the density, the increase in density, because that ended up passing 4-1, and it needed a fourth vote to be veto-proof.
Not only that, but it also triggered several lawsuits, which are, and again, regardless of how you feel about the density issue, it triggered lawsuits that cost the taxpayers money anyway. So it's
continuing to cost them.
So he's continuing to cost us money, even if he is living 2 or 3 hours away.
I think one of the aspects of the press of what you were saying there is that the uncritical acceptance of what people in power are saying is just against what the whole
It's the Fourth Estate, right? It's the whole
point of freedom of the press.
The point of freedom of the press is to act essentially as an informal check on authority.
Yes, it is not to. You don't go, like people in positions of power. You're like authority is actually supposed to be separate from power. I mean, that's part of like the university thing. Honestly, is that we have a lot of research that comes through the universities, and that's not necessarily driven by people in political positions of power. Right. Obviously, university is political, but. That's one of my biggest problems and disappointment in the press. I took journalism classes. I've worked for newspapers. I've been on, I did a radio show back in college. So I've always been interested in this kind of stuff. And it's just sad to me as an adult to see that our local community, where people have a career of decades, they have college degrees in this. And I see no journalism. I see, acceptance of people just in positions of power. And that's not really how they should be doing their job.
I think as a little side note to the history, some of the most important, groundbreaking investigative journalists, not just in this country but in others, tended to not have degrees in journalism. I'm not to say that that can't be useful, but certainly the individual local journalists who have taken exception to our even attempt to cover this stuff, the pearl clutching, frankly, from my perspective, I expect better from people that supposedly have that professional training.
And look, and honestly, we talked about this on our social media outlets when this came out last Friday because we knew it wasn't represented properly. We all have day jobs to some degree. So we film our shows on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's just a fact. And so we're not ready to run into the studio and put out a show on a Friday afternoon. But we're seeing, not just from this elected official, former elected official, but other elected officials, bad news is put out on Friday afternoon to help get it forgotten about by Monday morning.
Yeah.
When we get around the water coolers again.
Not this week.
So what do you want, Michael? I mean, you don't feel like this has been completely addressed, and at the same time, we don't know, is this a 2-month process or a 9-month process? Are you ready to let this go? I mean, he's out of office now. What do you want?
So my understanding of the process is I believe that he resigned to avoid the actual accountability.
Okay.
So my understanding is the next step of the process would have been an open meeting that would have been called, with the Board of Election would have called Mr. Dowdy to account. After that 10-day period, there would have been some scheduling of a meeting, and then he would have had to, in person, account for. Rather than face any of that, and rather than account for any of he just resigned. I think that actually puts the issue to bed in that regard, but I think that the fact that there was a process that my biggest thing was, in just over a month, that somebody who was, violating his oath of office, lying to the public, and frankly breaking the law, because the city charter and code forbid this kind of behavior, that because the city process was respected, because the city had a process that wasn't able to be swayed, because people followed through. I think that's the most important thing about our local government, and I think I'm very pleased with that.
So, Joe, I want to ask you, is this part of a bigger political complex? I mean, you brought up former Mayor Jake Day, who's the Secretary of Housing for the state of Maryland now. There's other politicians and other stated candidates out there who have also aligned with this pro-development, pro-subsidy political scene.
Yeah.
Do you think that the reason why former Council President Dowdy resigned was to protect that political machine?
I think to an extent. I think his initial instinct is just to protect himself, because I think that's what people like that do. But Mr. Dowdy comes out of, as you said, a petri dish that has developed locally here, largely through the former mayor and through Shore Progress, which Mr. Dowdy was an affiliate with, in which they run candidates who typically are young, who seem dynamic, who talk about change and challenging power, and the only change they get is when they cash the checks from the developers, it seems, from their campaign contributions or their jobs, because they are, unfortunately, in my opinion, the epitome of what is so dangerous about when local government is hijacked. They don't really care about regular people's concerns and issues. And let me say this, and again, don't take my word for it. Talk to people like Jermichael Mitchell and Kevin Lindsay. Talk to other people in District 2 who have talked about the fact that Mr. Dowdy was never a fixture in the community, who often never responded to constituent outreach, who often only came for photo ops and then disappeared. Now we know why. That kind of failure, not just on Mr. Dowdy's part, but that kind of failure is really concerning when we know that local government does have the greatest impact on our lives, and it is the greatest source of us as citizens to be empowered and to have a voice. So when you've got people that are bankrolled by special interests, when you've got people that are so duplicitous, so dishonest, so narcissistic to the point that they're willing to go through the lengths that Mr. Dowdy was in this cover-up, it is not only shocking and appalling, but it is deeply damaging to the nature of the community that he claims he cares about so much.
Well, I want to bring in Trish Melvin. She's followed this as a regular citizen as well, and I want to get a sense from her how she feels about the importance of the lack of transparency by the local media and by the press release that was put out by former President Deshaun Dowdy. All right, will you stay with us, Michael?
Absolutely.
All right. So when we come back, we're going to bring in Trish Melvin. We're going to find out her thoughts on the resignation of Deshaun Dowdy. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Open Agenda. Joining us back in the studio is Ms. Trish Melvin from Fruitland. Thank you for coming back. Mr. Michael Langford, thanks for sticking around.
Thanks for having me.
So we ran through the series of facts, the dates, the evidence that we know, and the misleading nature of the press release that was put out Friday. Trish, I want to ask you, you've been watching the story since Friday when it first came out, and also you've been listening even to radio interviews that have happened recently with former President Deshaun Dowdy. Do you feel like the press coverage, the mainstream press coverage, and the press release that's put out matches the information that you've seen here today?
I think there's a gap between the investigative work that the team's done and what I've heard, on the radio and have read.
Now you have been politically active with the county council, particularly with fighting against 287G. And Michael, I think you kind of describe yourself as someone who has a lot of left of center ideals. Deshaun Dowdy is on that same side. I mean, how do you feel about the fact that this is what has transpired?
I think that's one of the biggest misdirection tools in the propaganda locally, is that people often think that people are getting personal in some way when they're talking about a behavior or a position, right? And how people conduct themselves. You guys often talking about, like, say, County Executive Giordano, right? We're talking about the performance in that role, not that person, And in this case, Deshaun's not someone that I'm actually close to. He's someone that he asked me to be on a housing task force at one point for the city. Didn't go anywhere, wasn't effective, but, able to have a conversation with him, willing to hear me out, not actually against him being in that position, like outright, not against him as a person. And it's so when finding this out, and once I started digging and finding this, I'm like, this is so deeply wrong and disheartening to anybody on the left, because it's like people on the left right now, there's a lot of people that are very upset with the direction that the country is going, on a national scale to the local scale. And so, for us to have somebody who's, on the left, to have somebody who's a representative, that's somebody who cares about the values and the ideals that we all profess to uphold, and then to see them betray that by how they conduct themselves when they actually get into a position of power, it's
well,
sad.
What do you make of him? I mean, he is spoken at work sessions about adding a partisan element to the city of Salisbury elections, which is, I mean, as someone who's conservative on the right, I like the fact that the city of Salisbury doesn't have partisan elections. Does this play a factor in this whole deception game? I mean, is it hard to understand if we're more worried about the local folks, or are we more worried about the political machine?
I see I often see this tightening of a grip, on both sides of the political aisle, where they try to narrow who has access or ability. And I think that the move to change the city to partisan elections is that narrowing who can participate. And I do agree with you that it's like a terrible move for our community.
Well, Trish, you're a very independent-minded person. How do you feel? I know you're a resident of Fruitland, but how would it make you feel if you were a resident of Salisbury and we shift to this very partisan type of rhetoric, especially when you have folks who maybe ideologically align with you, but also deceive the public in this way?
At the local level, I don't think partisanship has a role, because public safety is not a partisan issue. Roads are not a partisan issue. The things that we address at the county council and are addressed at the city council are not necessarily partisan. And I think that detracts from the efficiency of resolving issues when you see it through the lens of partisanship. I think it's important, beyond local government, state and federal, of course, but at our level, I don't see where it has a role.
Now, I'm not a taxpayer of the city of Salisbury, but one of the questions I would have if I was is how much of the salary, it's not a very high salary, but how much of the salary that's been paid to the former council president, Deshaun Dowdy, has been collected illegally or of not true nature?
False pretenses.
False pretenses.
Yeah, I think where he is knowingly, intentionally deceiving people, I think the resignation is a maneuver that will help inoculate him from true accountability for those actions. I think that his resignation and saying that he's resigning for the quote-unquote right reasons, another opportunity, right, will prevent any further legal repercussions for him, which I believe is why he resigned.
Well, I mean, if we're going to have charter amendment changes like we see 2024-2 to change wording from residency to domiciled, maybe this is something that needs to be addressed on the go forward, that if someone does obtain payment for services that could not be rendered because they were really ineligible, that they should be responsible for those misappropriated funds. I mean, I think that's what we're seeing here.
I agree.
We've seen it with the county government, and we really, I think, are also seeing it with the city government here.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely. I said this in my comments last night. It's an extremely selfish act for him to assume a position of power when there are over 30,000 residents in the city that are now denied an opportunity to serve. Those people don't have access to have a say. And I agree wholeheartedly with Trish that most things, especially locally, I believe most laws can be justified through public health and safety, or they ought not to be at all.
Sure.
Or it's not if it's greater than that, it would not be a local issue.
Probably not.
Yeah, no, we're not deciding about abortion or gun control in a small municipality.
Yeah.
Yes, so those kinds of issues that can be very divisive. We actually, if you actually get involved, if you actually show up to the council meetings, you really have an ability to engage with people. And what I found is that it's not people that I necessarily on the surface thought I would ideologically believe. We believe the same thing, so of course we'll agree the same on this issue. That's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, which is welcoming, to say the least.
It is, because I mean, when you go back to listening, it's about conversations with people, listening to people, relationships with people. I mean, politics ultimately, in the best way, is about that.
Well, thank you both. I appreciate your coming back and your insight into just how this was handled from the public standpoint. Michael, thanks for all your investigative work. Good job. Way to stand up for the little guy.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this episode of Open Agenda. We'll be back later this week with another new episode.
My name is Michael Langford. When an elected official knowingly and intentionally violates the rule of law meant for us all, it is something deeply unethical and ought to bar them from the ability to serve a public office in the future. And it is in the public's best interest to know the actions which took place, because make no mistake, Mr. Deshaun Dowdy has misrepresented himself to such an extent that he has lied to the City Election Board, the City of Salisbury Incorporated Municipality, his fellow council members, his constituents of District 2, and every resident of the City of Salisbury, over 30,000 people who actually live here. By spending at least the majority of 2025 outside of Wicomico County, let alone the city, Mr. Dowdy has selfishly and callously acted upon a philosophy of rules for thee and not for me. It is deeply hypocritical and wrong for someone to gatekeep a position of power in this way to benefit themselves. It is one of the most shockingly selfish acts I've ever witnessed. He has broken the oath he took when he initially was appointed and took a seat on the council. Thus, I filed a complaint on October 2nd of this year, in which I provided over 60 pages of documentation to substantiate the claim that Mr. Deshaun Dowdy has been working and domiciling outside of his elected district, which disqualifies him from public service as council member for City Council per the City Code SC 2-2 and Charter Resolution number 2024-2. To share with people the process and the effort of transparency, so that people can know. The first thing that I did in this process was just listen. And people talk. And a lot of times I take things with a grain of salt. But when I continuously hear that Mr. Dowdy was living across the bridge from multiple people who don't believe the same things, that don't affiliate with one another, I just looked into it. And all I did was Google it. You can Google his name and the word bank, and you'll find out where he works. The wild part was going and finding that Deshaun was living in Essex, which for people who don't know where Essex is, that makes sense because it's Baltimore County, over 3 hours away. I listened, I followed a process, and I trusted city officials to carry out the city's investigation, and I waited. And the fruits of that process is that a corrupt politician is no longer in office, and that someone else from our city gets an opportunity to serve, and that people know that they can do more to better the quality of service we receive from the government by paying attention and upholding the integrity of a process. I want to thank the City Election Board and City Clerk for carrying out the process professionally and efficiently as was possible while Mr. Dowdy was non-responsive to the city's inquiries. To Mr. Dowdy, I say good riddance and look forward to seeing what City Council will be able to accomplish when the person at the helm, the chairperson, chooses to serve the public's interest and the residents of Salisbury over personal ambition and political theatrics. Sometimes public officials will do things we disagree with, which I think a lot of people are here tonight to talk about. But it is another more disturbing thing when a public official actually lies to us, violates their oath of office, and breaks the law. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Lang.
The issues with Mr. Dowdy run deep and are of grave concern. And again, I'm very disappointed that the local media, which unfortunately has political connections to Mr. Dowdy and to his main political benefactor, Jake Day, has refused to really investigate it. That is why citizens like us on Open Agenda have had to resort to investigative journalism as amateurs because there's been an absence of it. It's frankly disappointing and disgraceful.
I know what I'm doing, man.